Philip Pillsbury was a Yale University graduate, an All-American on the water polo team, a tenor in the Glee Club, a straight-A student. He was born in the famous milling family and ended up being at the top of the food chain in it as the chairman of the Pillsbury Food Company. But on the factory floor, no other executive was as respected as Philip Pillsbury, because he started out his career as a simple flour miller like everybody else would start. And his 3 missing fingertips on his right hand were proof. Every journeyman miller gets his fingertip caught in the grinder at some point. That happened to Philip 3 different times on 3 different fingers. So in his years as chairman, whenever an employee shook the boss's hand, the worker noticed those missing fingertips. And the handshake was a reminder that the boss was not above the same work as everybody else. And because he understood what it was like to work in the trenches, his employees loved him. In the last 4 chapters of 2 Corinthians, we're sort of experiencing a handshake with the Apostle Paul, who had a lot of scars to prove what he had done to deserve their respect. He sort of shows off his missing fingertips, what it had cost him personally to follow Christ. The grace of God had changed Paul's life, beginning on the road to Damascus, you remember it. And now, after he had established the churches in Corinth over a 1.5-year period and had moved away for a while, many of them were turning to false doctrine and to false leaders and false teachers. And Paul is now saying, how dare these charlatans in Corinth belittle God's work and the ministry that I did here. So in essence, in chapters 10 through 13, Paul holds up his missing fingertips, his scars and his sacrifices to prove the genuineness of his ministry and the truthfulness of the gospel that he had preached. But these people really were not getting along. I mean, we all know sometimes people don't get along together even in church. Maybe you've heard the story about the man who was shipwrecked on a deserted island for several years by himself. He was finally rescued, and as he was leaving, one of the rescuers asked him about the 3 grass huts he had built. And he said, well, the first one is my house, and the second one is my church. And his rescuer said, well, what about that 3rd hut? And he said, oh, that was the church I used to go to. Now, some of you will get that about 10 o'clock tonight, and you'll laugh out loud in bed and realize how funny that was. But even though Paul founded the church in Corinth, there were several factions within it, and there were several vocal critics of Paul. And some of the teachers were contradicting what he taught and making claims that they were the true apostles, and that Paul, who had been picked by God personally as the Gentile and the apostle to the Gentiles, was not a real apostle. And so verse 13 in our chapter tonight in the Message reads, he said, they're a sorry bunch, pseudo-apostles, lying preachers, crooked workers, posing as Christ agents, but sham to the core. And we read that and we think, why don't you say what you really mean, Paul? But that's the truth. That's the way he felt about them, and that's how much damage they were doing in the church. So some of the words that Paul writes in this chapter, beginning in the first verse, are going to seem a little strange to us, because he begins by confessing that he is engaging in a little foolishness. He said, I hope you will put up with a little more of my foolishness. Please bear with me. Now that may not make sense until you understand that Paul is employing literary irony there. Irony is a little bit like sarcasm. but it's not quite as biting as full-on sarcasm. And so he says then in verse 2, "For I'm jealous for you with the jealousy of God himself, because I promised you as a pure bride to one husband, Christ." Now notice, Paul didn't say he was jealous of the Corinthians. He said he was jealous for the Corinthians. Big difference between the two. Every father should be jealous for his children, and especially his daughters. And the church is the bride of Christ. We hear a lot about jealousy being bad, and it does say in 1 Corinthians 13 that love is not jealous, but there's a big difference between being jealous of someone and being jealous for someone. I'll give you an example. If somebody wins an award and you're miffed because you think you deserved it and you think really you should have won it, that's being jealous of them. And that's sinful. Love is not jealous. However, if you love someone, you will be jealous for them because you want to protect them. And Paul identifies his jealousy here as a godly jealousy. And I no more was studying that till I realized that just this past Sunday, in our series, The Big Ten, we were on the third commandment that says the exact same thing. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. So Paul, really here in chapter 11, is just portraying himself as a jealous father who is protective of the church that he founded in Corinth. Probably my favorite picture of the church in the Bible is the portrayal as a bride and Jesus as the bridegroom. Following Jewish marriage customs, we are betrothed to Christ, and one day our bridegroom will come and surprise us and claim us and take us home. According to Revelation chapter 19, he will take us to the Father's house for the great marriage celebration that will never end. And Paul is jealous over his church bride and upset that these false teachers were coming in and threatening to distract or detain the bride from her true position in Christ. In other words, Paul was one of those daddies sitting on the porch in a rocking chair with a shotgun across his lap saying to those teachers, "You want to do what with my little girl?" It sort of reminds me about what journalist Jim Bishop once said. Watching your daughter being collected by her date feels like handing over $1 million Stradivarius to a gorilla. Those who have had daughters, I think, probably understand that. So what's the application for us in this picture of a jealous father of the bride? Here, I think, is the takeaway truth for us. We must stay devoted only to Christ, as a bride to the bridegroom. And Paul expresses his fatherly concern with these words. But I fear that somehow your pure and undivided devotion to Christ will be corrupted. Just as Eve was deceived by the cunning ways of the Spirit. Paul was right to worry. Earlier, he had described the cunning ways of the devil as the schemes or the wiles of the devil, writing to the church at Ephesus. His schemes, his wiles, his tactics, his cunning ways are lethal. Remember, Satan has been at it a long, long time. Not too long ago, I had somebody out in the hall one Sunday after church because of something I said in a message ask me, "Do you think Satan can read our minds?" I've never been asked that question before. I said, I don't like to answer questions without having thinking about it and studied it, so let me get back to you. The next week I got back to them and I said, I see no evidence in Scripture that Satan can read our minds. I don't think the answer is yes. I think Satan has limited powers, particularly in the Christian age. But here's the deal. He doesn't have to, because he's had plenty of time to study human behavior. He knows what buttons to push in what people. Seduction is his business. Being cunning is his way. And he's been luring folks into his web for millennia. And even though his temptations remain the same, he is constantly refining his approach and his methods. So here in verse 3, Paul recalls the serpent's ploy in the Garden of Eden. I think it's interesting that God's demands have always been simple, as we used to sing, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. But Satan complicates that with a series of what-ifs like he did with Eve in the garden. With a series of, well, maybe not, or second guesses, or, well, God said that, but have you thought about this? Are you sure God is right? And that's how he trapped Eve in the garden and caused her literally to eat herself out of house and home. So we are the bride of the bridegroom. Jesus cleans us up, and then it's up to us to stay clean. I have performed, I do not know, hundreds of weddings in my life. And the bride always takes extreme care to look absolutely beautiful on her wedding day. I have never seen a bride that was not beautiful and gorgeous. She spends several hours getting her hair done, her makeup applied. She makes sure her dress, her shoes, her jewelry are perfect. So now why is it you think that the Lord used the church as the bride of Christ and Christ as our bridegroom? Same reason. We shouldn't let anyone or anything distract us from the love of Jesus for our being pure and ready for his return. And he is going to come back for us someday. And as the bride of Christ, we have to stay devoted to him. The next verse says, you happily put up with whatever anyone tells you, even if they preach a different Jesus than the one we preach, or a different kind of spirit than the one you received, or a different kind of gospel than the one you believe. Paul was worried, obviously, here about the Corinthians' spiritual discernment. The believers in Corinth had already revealed just how gullible they were by putting up with all these false teachers, charlatans, phonies he called them, who had been feeding them lies and were in it for themselves. The Corinthians, the young Corinthians Christians, and to be fair, they were young, failed to realize that not everybody who talks the talk walks the walk. You can speak for God, even claim to be God's spokesperson, but that doesn't mean you know him. There are phonies on the circuit. Whenever a grandma enters our church with big eyes and a great big nose and furry whiskers and huge fang-like teeth, even though she refers to herself as a grandma, somebody among us needs to be thinking wolf. And Paul is saying that is a father's job. That's why he's worried here about the bride of Christ, the church in Corinth. In today's church, those who are thinking that are our elders. The father of the bride is supposed to protect the daughter. Among the elders' qualifications, as well as what we see them doing in Scripture, is playing that particular role to protect the church. And notice what Paul says. These people who are false teachers come preaching another Jesus, a different kind of spirit, a different kind of gospel. You need to know that the Jesus some people speak of is not the true Jesus. There are many imposters. There are. Let me just give you a few examples. When Mormons talk of Jesus, they do not mean the eternal Son of God. That's not what they mean. They mean a former human, a spirit child who worked his way up the ladder to godhood. That's not what the New Testament teaches. When Jehovah's Witnesses speak of Jesus, they're not referring to God incarnate, but to some created being, an archangel, the brother of Lucifer, no less. I never minded when Jehovah's Witnesses came and knocked on my door. I would greet them. I would say quite simply, tell me exactly what you believe about Jesus. The hemming and hawing would start, and some answer that was mostly pablum that they had been fed, but wasn't the true New Testament story of Jesus, would come out, and I would say, we really don't have anything to discuss. There's a liberal Jesus, a good teacher Jesus, nothing divine about him. No virgin birth, no walking on water, not even a resurrection in his resume. There's a prosperity Jesus that some on TV preach, who rather than lay aside his worldly wealth and come as a servant and live for heaven, he was worldly rich, and he wants you to be rich and famous and powerful and live forever too. He lived his best life now, all the time. There's a therapeutic Jesus that has developed over the last 30 or 40 years who massages your guilt and props up your self-esteem. He's a feel-good guru who never speaks of sin or hell or judgment. The Muslims have a Jesus, a prophet of Allah. Some homosexuals even promote a gay Jesus. In America, you can absolutely find a political Jesus of both the Republican and the Democrat variety. Yet there is only one true Jesus, the Jesus of history, whose story is accurately conveyed in the pages of the Scriptures, the same Jesus that Paul, when he was Saul, met on the road to Damascus, and who was converted and spent the rest of his life preaching and teaching for Jesus until he was martyred for him. Make sure you are following the right Jesus, he's saying to the Corinthians. And then he says, but I don't consider myself inferior in any way to these super apostles who teach such things. Wow. And he's really getting down where the rubber meets the road here. He didn't just make that phrase up. Some of these false teachers were so impressed with titles that they had begun to call themselves super apostles. Really? Wasn't just enough for the original disciples and for Matthias and Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles? They were also now titling themselves apostles, and not just apostles, but super apostles. It reminds me of what a lot of preachers today have done. To impress their flock, they need a title with some clout. And so there are some preachers, some on television, who call themselves bishop. Well, bishop is the same word that is used in the New Testament to describe the office of elder. It's the same word to describe the office of pastor. Episcopus, it's the same office being discussed there. And when you're bishop, you know what might come next and has come next with some of these false teachers, even as I speak tonight, is the word apostle. And today, some of these people are super apostles. Now, despite their self-given titles, Paul had far more apostolic chops than any of them had. He says, even though I'm untrained in speech, yet I'm not untrained in knowledge. That didn't mean he was a boring speaker. To the contrary, when he spoke, he struck straight to the heart. And this is how anybody should ever evaluate any preacher. Me, anybody else that stands in this pulpit, anybody you watch on television or listen to on the radio, what they say should always be more important than how they say it. We've all heard preachers who were great speakers, and they can be funny or folksy or dramatic, and when you hear them, you leave thoroughly entertained. You're just not really quite sure what the guy actually said. So what if it sounds good if it isn't good and it doesn't do any good? And remember, the proof of a good preacher is not that his congregation goes away saying, what a great preacher or what a great sermon, but if his congregation goes away saying, what a great Jesus. I'm going to follow Jesus more and closer because of what I just learned. In essence, Paul is saying here, I'm an open book to the Corinthians. Now, they undoubtedly should have been ashamed for doubting him and his motives, because he had lived among them for a year and a half and had always proven his sincerity up close and in person. But he says, I may be unskilled as a speaker, but I'm not lacking in knowledge. We have made this clear to you in every possible way. Was I wrong when I humbled myself and honored you by preaching God's good news to you without expecting anything in return? The super apostles who were taking over with their false teaching in the church were robbing the people blind. You'll see that in the next text. We're robbing the people. Remember, while in Corinth, Paul had worked to support himself. He had partnered with Aquila and Priscilla in their tent-making business. He had been a bivocational preacher, missionary in Corinth. He could have legitimately drawn a salary. He was entitled to one according to the scriptures, but he refused because he didn't want to give anybody any reason to say he was only in it for the money. Yet here's the twisted logic of the false teachers. Instead of realizing the integrity in Paul's approach, they said the real reason that he didn't take money from anybody in the ministry is that he didn't merit one. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't a true apostle. They said Paul was getting exactly what he was worth. Nothing. Talking about guys who had it all backwards, today we don't know any of their names. They should have been rewarding Paul for his faithfulness. Instead, they were penalizing him. The truth was, even the super rich Corinthians, and it was a rich city and a rich church, couldn't pay Paul what he was truly worth. So he described how he actually survived in his year and a half building churches and being a missionary in Corinth. He said, I robbed other churches. Robbed, again, he's using the irony, the sarcasm. I robbed other churches by accepting their contributions so I could serve you at no cost. He took offerings from the other churches in northern Greece, from Philippi and Berea and Thessalonica, poorer churches than Corinth. And he looked to them to support his ministry in Corinth. The Greek word translated robbed is a colorful word. It was used for stripping the armor off of a dead soldier. So Paul was saying, I literally took the clothes off the backs of the northern Greek churches to support the church in Corinth. And it wasn't just that the Corinthians lacked appreciation of his efforts. What's worse is they twisted the meaning of his actions and then turned around and used them against him. How utterly awful. And so, Paul concludes his message in this area by saying this: "But I will continue doing what I've always done. This will undercut those who are looking for an opportunity to boast that their work is just like ours. These people are false apostles. They are deceitful workers who disguise themselves as apostles of Christ." And then he is going to say what is, in my opinion, the most frightening phrase in all of the New Testament. This phrase has bothered me since I was a 17-year-old and read it for what I think was the first time, or at least realized what it was saying. But I'm not surprised. Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no wonder that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. In the end, they will get the punishment their wicked deeds deserves. The implications of this verse are utterly extraordinary. Many times I've been asked, what verse scares you most in the Bible? This one scares me the most. You say, not verses about hell? No, I'm aware of those. But the fact that Satan can disguise himself to look like me to you, or the way you look to me, is utterly frightening. It was Shakespeare who said, "The devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape." And that's pretty well a commentary on that verse. Satan is a master of disguises. He goes by 1 million aliases. He has a zillion fake IDs and phony passports. He skirts detection. That's why Satan and his agents almost never appear in a devil's suit with a red tail. No, he almost always appears in very appealing packages. He comes as the beautiful blonde in the bikini. He comes as the clean-cut Mormon missionary talking about family values and having a family night every night in your home at your front door. He comes as the father figure you think you can trust. He comes as the polished preacher in a t-shirt and jeans. He comes as the buddy who offers you pills to cure your ills. He comes in all kinds of pleasing disguises. And we have to be prepared for that. Satan and his operatives are slick and sophisticated. They're polished and pleasing to the eye, but they are hell-bent on your destruction. That's his sole goal. Expect Satan to offer you a deal so sweet you overlook the fine print or overlook the one catch, because he's always trying to get you to sell your soul to the devil. He specializes in false advertising. He wraps temptation in pretty wrapping paper, not a dirty, old, musty, torn bag, because he wants to deceive you like these people were deceiving the church in Corinth. True story. A little girl was given a soft, cuddly teddy bear as a gift from a friend. And when she tried to take the stuffed animal on the airplane for the first time, the TSA screening found a .22 caliber pistol sewed into its lining. Someone had hid it there 3 years earlier. That person had a child steal the teddy bear from them, give it to this little girl. And that, by the way, is why everything going onto a plane needs to be screened, whether we like it or not. And everything going on in a church needs to be screened too. We have to pay attention to make sure it's not another Jesus, a different spirit, the text says, or a different gospel. Because in those cases, different are deadly.